So we are so thrilled to have with us here today Attorney Andrew Feinstein, who is an attorney here in Connecticut, in Mystic, Connecticut, a special education attorney who's been integrally involved with the parents in this particular issue, and Molly Van Wagenen, who is one of the leading parents involved in organizing this very important, what we consider an expose of some fundamental violations of civil rights in Darien. So I'm going to start with you, Molly. If you could tell us a little bit what happened, what started all of this.
Last summer, we had a change in administration in our town in Darien, and part of the administration change was a new special education director. There were some other changes below the special education director as well. When she came in, we subsequently found out or assumed that it was with the intention to bring some of the spending into check that was happening in Darien. As you know, IDEA is not a fully funded mandate from the government. So anyhow, I had a meeting about our youngest son in July, the end of July, right after she had come in, and had to talk about his plan for the following year. And when the meeting went fine, but when we got the information back, or the paperwork, it really bore no relation to what we had discussed, and all of his services had been completely stripped away from him. There were some very minimal services remaining, but our son is a smart child. He has multiple disabilities. He has dyslexia, he has ADHD, he has dyscalculia, childhood apraxia of speech. And the way that I think about Jack is, as on the surface, he is a smart child, but these holes that he has, he's like Swiss cheese. And these holes are very, very deep. And without the support of those areas, he will not survive, he will not learn. And so to have seen those fundamental services taken away from him, I was shocked.
And this was an IEP team meeting.
This was an IEP team meeting that we had, and it was truly shocking to see how much had been stripped out of his plan. And it didn't seem that any person who was a teacher could possibly think that this child could survive, and so it was hard to understand what the motive was. And then at the same time, another friend of mine also had something happen. She had a consultant or a tutor written into her IEP for her child. And that she got a call from that tutor saying that she had been fired by the new director of special education, which is against the law to make any changes to your IEP outside of the meeting.
Right.
We happened to talk to each other, and out of that meeting, our discussion, came a support group that we formed in our town called Speducated Parents that was mostly an educational group.
Right. And just to make a distinction, I think that you can change players, that's why it's often that IEPs don't want to write in names of providers. Right. In your case, though, the name of the provider was written in, so when there was a change, that was a violation of the IEP.
That was alarming.
Yes.
That
and the big red flags being that what happened at the meeting was not what was reflected in the paperwork when it came home.
That's right.
Which, as Julie and I talk a lot about on her videos, is a big no-no, big
of
problem.
It.
Yes,
yes,
exactly.
Parents need to read every single page that comes home.
And so my understanding is from that point, you decided to form an organization within town, and upon talking to more and more parents and having people like Andy come in and speak with you, realizing that this was more of a systemic problem. If you want to talk more about that in Darien.
Yeah, so what we found is we formed our group, and it was really an educational group, and we did, as you said, have experts come in to speak to parents. And my friend and I had received a lot of questions from other parents because the system is incredibly opaque, it's incredibly confusing, and it takes understanding from somebody who's been through it to try to understand for yourself. And so through those meetings that we had a number of questions that were voiced to us or to the experts. And upon hearing these questions, the other people in the room would say, that can't happen, that's illegal. But this reaction happened over and over and over and over. And so what we originally assumed was an anomaly, a mistake, what the district termed, I think Andy's favorite, a clerical error on many occasions, we realized quite quickly was systemic.
Right.
Was systemic. But beyond that, we also started to hear from teachers. And teachers are a very big part of this equation because they have restrictions placed on them that we also have discovered through their union contracts. They really have difficulty talking because they can be considered insubordinate. And even if they're not considered insubordinate, there are other ways to be retaliated against as a teacher for telling parents what they have the right to know, but the district doesn't want them to know.
Right.
So we started to hear from teachers that there had been some training materials put together in the town that clearly showed violations of our federal law idea that regulates the civil rights for children with disabilities in school.
Right.
And so we made an FOI request, which is one of the limited means available to parents to get information, because we don't have the ability to make a full discovery, for example, like you would in a lawsuit. So we made this request.
And let me just stop you there for a second. Freedom of Information Act is what she's referring to in FOI, which are also known as the Sunshine Laws. And we can talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But you made an FOI request for the documents.
We made a few.
Okay.
They didn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
They supposedly didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
As time was moving forward, we were having more meetings, hearing more issues, and eventually this document landed in our laps anonymously.
Okay.
And so there was a teacher, we don't know which teacher, somebody came to the plate and sent this to us, and everything changed at that point.
Okay. So you want to talk about the document, Andy? Because I know this is really the smoking gun that lawyers often don't get, but dream
Exactly.
about. Yeah.
This was a document entitled Achieving Consistency within Darien Public Education. There were 20 bullets on it covering various issues. In most cases, the recommendations were recommendations that were just plainly in violation of the law. The biggest one was, of course, that the team should meet in advance, decide what's going to be offered at an IEP team meeting, and make no changes after the meeting of the IEP team, which includes the parent. That's called predetermination. It's something which the courts have struck down on a number of occasions. There was also provisions about ensuring that students were not provided one-on-one speech and language services, that students were not provided assistive technology services, that feeding services were discontinued, that outside consultants were not to be used. Those were all contained in this document. So what happened was I got this document from a little bird, wrote up a memo about how it violated the law, and found the section in the IDEA which says that the state has the responsibility for ensuring that local school districts comply with the law. The IDEA, as you know, is a spending statute where the federal government gives money to the states in exchange for their commitment to comply with the requirements of the law. And one of the requirements is that local school districts are policed by the state to ensure that they comply with the law. So based on that, I drafted this letter and then made contact with the group in Darien, decided it would be far better coming from a group of parents than coming from a lawyer out of town. And eventually some 25 parents signed off on this letter, and we submitted it to the state on March 20th. The response of the State Department of Education was lackluster. Finally, under enormous pressure, they came down to Darien in early May, held a meeting with an open meeting for parents. On a rainy night, some 150 parents showed up. During the course of the time, 25 parents spoke, every one of them talking about how the rights of their child had been violated. The state then went back, and I should say that after this first document, other documents started surfacing. PowerPoint presentations that had been made by the special ed director at the high school, the middle schools, and at the elementary school. New eligibility requirements. Remarkably, some of those had as their letterhead Bloomfield Public Schools, where the special ed director had previously worked. That material, the state asked Darien for material, got some 800 pages from Darien, and in late July, the state issued their first report, finding some 16 areas where Darien had violated the law. And in that report, I guess it was late June, not late July. And in that report, there was some reference to this was the first of two reports. The state has never formally said what the second report is about, and will not answer questions about that. In any case, at that public meeting, a number of parents talked about changes made to their child's IEP after the IEP had allegedly been finalized. That is such a clear smoking gun violation of the law that the state really paid attention to that. Further, the special ed director was put on an administrative leave immediately after that due to that.
To leave with pay?
With pay.
Yeah.
She's on leave with pay at the moment.
Right.
And what happens now is up to the Darien administration.
Right.
Sure.
And this story has gone as far as the Wall Street Journal,
Right.
and we have it here with
right.
us. What's interesting and ironic to me is that the document that came to you came through a teacher who had been given these materials. And it's ironic to me for a number of reasons, one of which is that the very violation that I consider the most important one, and I think you do also, Andy, the mandate that any disagreement that an educator has with the special ed director about a child's program should be aired out before the IEP meeting and not brought up at the meeting really flies in the face of what the whole crux of the IDEA statute wanted those IEP teams to be doing, because it's supposed to be a dialogue. It's supposed to be an open, free flow of discussion that involves the parents and involves the educators who are working with the child on a daily basis. And those educators are supposed to be, by law, free to participate in that process without fear of being retaliated against or fired, etc. And the message that the director sent out was, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to issue any disagreement you have. And we all know, those of us who practice in this field, unfortunately, that not only is this happening in Darien, but this happens all over the state and all over the country, where teachers are under a lot of societal and administrative pressure not to say what the student needs at the IEP meeting for fear of retaliation from their administration, even though those teachers do have protections under federal law for advocating for students with disabilities. We all know no teacher wants to go through the trouble of having to sue their employer, though, in order to say what the child needs. So the irony is the very thing that this obstructionism was aiming for flew right in their face, because a teacher obviously understood. And we know, I know Andy and I have talked about this a lot, and Julie and I talk about this. I get emails, comments, phone calls from teachers all of the time and related service providers who say to me, and a lot of my clients who say, I was giving your name off the record from a teacher, who say, I hate this. I got into this field because I care about children, and I'm under all this pressure not to say what children need in these meetings. And so the irony that that's how you got the information is pretty striking to me.
Can I say one other thing?
Of course.
That the process of predetermination cuts the parents out of the process.
That's right.
Right.
School officials often operate under the mistaken belief that parents exaggerate their children's disabilities or deny their children's disabilities, or in some cases, they believe that parents do both. My experience, and I'm sure your experience, is that parents know their child the best, know their strengths and weaknesses, know what they can and can't do, and cutting the parents out of the process guarantees that you're not going to have an intelligent program for the child.
That's exactly right. And one of my favorite phrases from a court decision was that the procedural safeguards of having parents be meaningful participants in the development of their child's IEP weren't just hoops through which the Congress wanted school districts to have to jump. There's a reason for it, and the reason is that parents have the longest history with the child, and ensuring their participation is the most likely way that the substantive document, the actual IEP, will actually confer an appropriate program for the child. Because we all know teachers turnover, administrations turnover, as is very well evidenced in this, and parents have known this child for the longest period of time. And to shut them out of that process isn't just illegal, but it's pedagogically foolish on top of it. So it's a very good point.
Well, we did have a number of meetings throughout the course of the year in Darien where the only one speaking from the school side was the special ed director.
Yeah.
The teachers were silent as well.
Yeah.
They were told to be silent, and they were told to nod at the appropriate times.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like, from what you said, Molly, that their union contracts also have language in it that prohibits them from perhaps speaking as well, in addition to pressure perhaps put on them.
Yes, and I think that this process has been very interesting from my perspective, because I've learned a lot about the laws that do help our children, but the very real limits placed on those laws.
Right.
And I would include some of the union issues in that arena, even though those aren't the federal laws. But the biggest ones that I see are the FOI, Freedom of Information, FERPA, which allows you to see your children's records.
Family Education Rights and Privacy Act.
And the IDEA, which came out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right.
But then on the other side, we have the contracts. We have the teachers' contracts and the administrators' contracts. And I would also actually add another one. And I don't know if it would be technically HIPAA, but it's the privacy surrounding children who have any type of disabilities.
Right.
And so although these laws are on the books to make our society better by raising up everybody in our society to be
Productive adults. Right.
there are some limitations both from funding and based on the ability to enforce these laws. They're on the book, but their enforceability is virtually none. And so it has come down to us as the parents to make this as public as we can, because the real reason that change is happening in Darien is because the discussion has gone from one of very limited, it's us versus them. If a child with disability gets something, it means my other worthier child does not, to a better understanding of why we have these policies, why they matter, why this is good policy.
And I think to talk about that, the sort of special ed child pinned against the regular education child, I think we have to mention the backdrop in this country that special education has become a very controversial matter based on the fact that IDEA is a partially funded mandate and that the towns take on the biggest burden in financially, and there is resentment that is built up about that issue. If you look at the Wall Street Journal article that was online about the very issue here in Darien, you'll see all sorts of comments or vitriol about kids with special education needs. And I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we need to raise awareness in this country of what disabilities are, whether it's a garden variety learning disability to an autism spectrum disorder, and the impact that that disability has on a child and what their future of being a productive adult is. Raising awareness of that, raising awareness of the IDEA and that this is a federally funded law that is there to protect students with disabilities. And I think I can assume that if you don't have a child who has a disability, you might not know too much about these things. And so it might be easy to jump to the conclusion, what are we spending all this money on kids with disabilities? And I think that's a real barrier for the disability rights movement and the civil rights matter.
Let me talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
So the first fact is that about 13% of school children nationwide are designated as eligible for special education services. On average, a child with disability costs about twice as much a year to educate as a child without a disability. That's not surprising. They need special services. The payoff, though, is enormous. We are taking children who otherwise would be dependent on government programs for the rest of their lives and making some number of them independent and productive members of society. The cost of special education is trivial compared to the long-term benefit produced by those children. The second fact that's important to note is that perhaps the biggest driver of special ed costs is out-of-district placements. My experience, and I think Jen's experience is the same, is that most parents want their kids in the regular school with their neighbors, and only agree to an out-of-district placement when the school district cannot provide the services necessary. By cutting back on related service providers, by cutting back on consultants, by cutting back on hours of service, what Darien did was cheapen the value of education within district, forcing many parents out of district, thereby raising the costs even in the short term of special education in Darien. It really was a penny-wise, pound-foolish approach.
Yeah, and I think further to that point, there's two things I want to point out about that Darien piece of it. One is the irony is for all the complaints about cost that you saw, not just in the Wall Street Journal comments, but the comments on the Darien Times articles on this, some of which were truly reprehensible and clearly prejudiced and ignorant, among other things, and other choice words I could come up with. But the irony is, yet in this particular case, I know you've uncovered in your many records requests an email that instructed basically that in fact the school district is prepared to spend as much money on the lawyers, their lawyers, as necessary in this situation rather than fixing the situation. That's correct, right? We have the email.
That's right.
We'll be happy to put it up on our site. So that just is astounding. We'd rather spend the money on the lawyers than on the children, which is really goes against everything we hope we all believe about education. But also Darien, for those of you who are not Connecticut people and may not understand this, Darien's a small town and it's an affluent town. It boasts having the best high school in the state of Connecticut, which in and of itself has some pretty good schools. The irony of this is that every building you walk into in Darien, and I've walked into many of them, you walk under a banner that says
Mission
Blue Ribbon
statement.
School, mission statement, excellence, etc. And yet parents of children with disabilities are told, oh, well, by federal law, we only have to offer you an appropriate program, and so sorry for you. And so it's such an irony that a district that prides itself on its education is so blatantly saying we don't really care about the education of children with disabilities.
And actually, for a town that is quite affluent, the town supports its public schools. The number of children, I don't know the percentages, but that are sent to private schools is relatively low compared to other towns of comparable net worth, I suppose.
Right.
And so education is valued in the town, and it did just create a two-tier system, and the ability for the Darien Times in particular to write about what has happened has changed the conversation considerably in the town. And we do think that because of the limitations to the enforceability of these laws, that it has required a much greater public awareness campaign, because in truth these changes have happened because the officials in our town have been shamed into it.
Right.
That it really has been shame that they have realized what has happened in their town. They have been part of it. They have advocated it, and now we are all their neighbors. We are the neighbors of the Board of Education members, the neighbors of the Board of Finance members. Many of the administrators live in our fairly local community, and so it is the understanding beyond anything else of the shame that is involved with doing this to children that has made the biggest difference thus far.
I'm so encouraged by what you say, that you think there has been a difference in Darien because you've educated and enlightened and increased awareness within the people within the town.
There's a long way to go.
But what I mean by that is on a national level, because when I think about this issue, we can't go back. We can't go back. We must go forward. It is not okay to discriminate against people who have disabilities. We as a nation have to figure out how to do this. We don't want to be at odds with our public school systems.
No.
We don't want to have to speak ill of public school systems. But there has to be a way to figure out how to forge a path as we move forward, where we're increasing awareness of disabilities, increasing awareness of the IDA and the other laws that protect students with disabilities, as well as why we must, from what Andy was saying, the cost-benefit analysis of doing good intervention with kids. And I know that, Molly, we wanted you to talk about the fact that, because we really want this to be a call to action. We don't want to just sit here to be a bunch of talking heads. We're actually doing this for what we hope is a really good reason. We want to reach out to parents of students who have disabilities, and also administrators and staff and people who work in school districts become aware of this issue. But hopefully by what you've done in Molly, with the help of Andrew and the other 24 parents who've been actively involved with you, give us some steps on what people can do if they suspect these types of things are happening in their district.
Well, I think the first thing to do is to be willing to talk about what's happening, because I think many of us still feel that we really need to shield our children's privacy, because this is a very private issue and it is a vulnerable issue. And so we have to, the very first thing that I will say is that you have to be able to talk about what's happening with your family and with your child, to your neighbor, to your friend. So once you can become comfortable talking, then you're going to start to get information that matters. And not only will you get information that matters for yourself, the same way that I asked parents when I needed to find out how to navigate the system, and parents now ask me how to navigate the system. But if you collect enough information together, you can have a much broader understanding, because, as I said before, the face of disability is not one. I mean, there's so what we're talking about is such a very broad and varied description of a child, that how we found the biggest challenge to be how do you bring parents together to affect change in a town when each one of our children is entirely different from the next. And so I think that there's a number. First you start talking, these groups are wonderful. We formed a group. There are many national groups to become a part of. I actually co-chair a scholarship for smart kids with learning disabilities. They have a wonderful website. So first you have to get the information. But once you get the information, what do you do with it? And I think that what's very important is that you're talking about the need to understand these laws, but what we really need is efficiency too. I think that was one thing that you didn't mention, and needing to stand up for these children. We all want efficiency. We don't want to be spending more money than we need. But what I came to realize as a parent a few years ago, which I think was very, very helpful, was that in this small town, small school, where I had a lovely relationship with my child's teacher, and we could talk about his cute haircut or what book I read for Halloween, that the school system is a government agency. And it is a government agency that is filled with bloat, it is filled with inefficiencies, it is filled with red tape, change happens slowly. And once you can realize that you are dealing with a government agency and that you have to advocate for your child, because if you don't advocate for your child, you are doing a disservice not only to him or to her, but to the entire society, because your child will not reach his potential if you do not actively advocate. But you have to recognize what you're going to come up against, that you're going to try to have a conversation with a teacher that makes common sense, but actually she's going to refuse to talk to you because she'll say, we can only talk about that in a PPT. We need to schedule that. We can't schedule it for a month. And that is incredibly frustrating. So you have to learn how to deal with the system. But when you deal with the system, I think one piece of advice that I would give to all parents is go in and talk to your teacher, your child's teacher, the first day of school, and say, you and I are going to have a great relationship. I trust you as a teacher. I believe in you as a teacher. But I have to advocate for my child, and I wear two different hats. So one hat is just the parent in the classroom, but the other hat is to make sure that he's getting what he needs, and this is not a reflection of you as the teacher.
It's a great suggestion.
So one of the things about that is that you and I know we go to IEP Team meetings, and teachers report that everything is wonderful. That the kid's doing great.
Right.
And there's no data to support it.
Right.
And when we asked for data, the data was left back in the room or was destroyed over the summer or doesn't exist. Parents have to insist on verification of progress.
Or in my case, I was told that my child purposefully failed a test.
Yes.
My 5-year-old who couldn't read purposefully failed his test.
Which would be possibly another area of concern from a special education perspective if he were that planful at 5 to deceive the adults in his life.
There was another mother in our group whose son did poorly on a test and was told, oh, he must have just forgotten because he knew that. Well, the kid has a memory disorder.
Right, exactly. But this is an excellent point, which is, it sounds terrible, but it's a very hard thing for parents to get past. The innate trust that you have of your school district. It's a very natural feeling that you expect that the educators working with your children have your child's best interest at heart, and it is a bureaucracy. I mean, the reality is there are politics, there are competing laws that are difficult sometimes to reconcile, and there are pressures that are put on the educators. So I think that that's a suggestion that will go a long way for a lot of parents to make it very clear. This isn't personal. This isn't about you as a teacher or you as a person. This is my job. This is my obligation, is to advocate for my child. But the progress, the everything's going great thing, the hard thing with that is that every parent wants to hear that. What parent doesn't want to hear how well their child is doing, how great they're doing, etc. And one thing Julie and I talk quite a bit about is listening to your instincts as a parent. Almost every parent I've represented has said to me, well before I called you, I had a bad feeling for a long time that something was going wrong or they weren't quite leveling with me as to what was going on. And it's rare that the first call is the lawyer. Usually that's after a long period of time.
A long time.
So other than
the other thing that schools do is obfuscate, and the use of jargon has just exploded in the last few years. And with the advent of the Common Core curriculum, it's getting far, far worse. And so for parents, when they hear a bunch of jargon which they're not supposed to understand that you're not supposed to understand that, and you need to ask questions that can give you the answers that you do understand. If somebody talks to you in terms that are inexplicable, they probably are meant that way. They're probably meant to obfuscate.
And I think you have to recognize as well that every single player in the room has a different goal. And even if those goals, like a Venn diagram, even if they overlap in places, and that hopefully your child's well-being is somewhere in that overlap, they're not all the same. Your teacher wants to keep his job.
Right.
That's a different goal than making sure your child can learn to read at a level 8. It's just a different goal.
Right.
And I think that we can take it down to the personal, but everything that we've seen at the personal, we can take up to the community as well.
Yes.
And when you talk about the bureaucracy and the trust, that issue between a teacher and a parent is the first line. But it goes far beyond that. And so we found that in Darien with the Board of Ed, we actually emailed the Board of Ed 3 separate times with all of the issues that we saw in Darien before we filed the petition with the state.
Right.
And we never received a response.
Not even a response.
Not a response.
Right.
And the biggest issue for parents that we heard them say when they came on that rainy night in Darien and stood up and told truly horrifying stories was that they were afraid to talk, but because other people did put their names out and did talk, they were willing to come.
Right.
And
So it's that fear of retaliation as a parent, which I
and
hear
it's
over and over again.
retaliation, and also this is your community.
Yes.
And so you don't want to stir the pot. You want
Right.
life to be
Right,
Sure.
of course. And when I say retaliation, I mean, and we've all heard it, what impact will this have on my child at school? Will the teachers
or in the
look at him
community.
differently?
Right.
Or in the community, right.
And you know, sometimes that does happen, and it happens in subtle ways, like the communication freezes up, they stop talking to you, as you talked
Yeah.
about. But you know, one of the problems that I see with this barrier to progress is that factor you talk about where parents, for whatever reason, don't feel like they can or should talk about it. And it is so essential that parents come out and realize that there is strength in numbers,
Right.
and that the opportunity to change the culture in a town, and hopefully,
Right.
you know, you will have changed the culture, hopefully, in Darien by making people understand, raising awareness of the fact this isn't just a federal mandate for the fun of
Right.
it. This has real impact. And I think when people hear about this story, when I read comments and I hear people talking about it, I don't think that people, even educators, even very sophisticated people, attorneys who Andy and I sometimes represent who are parents, sometimes that procedural rights issue becomes very esoteric, and what does it really matter? And what I think needs to be understood, and if you could share a little bit with your own story, is how these violations actually impact children, how they result in deprivation of services for kids.
So if we take the example of our youngest child, who I had said has multiple disabilities, including dyslexia, ADD, dyscalculia, which is a math disability, and a very serious speech disorder, which is akin to verbal dyslexia. So for our son, everything is in his mind, but the ability to pull it out is very difficult. His processing speed is slow, for example. So when he was in the public school, in the kindergarten there, he started to come home not wanting to go to school. He cried every day before school. He asked me what was wrong with him. He asked me why his brain was broken. He asked why he couldn't be like all the other kids, why he couldn't be regular, pretended he could read books when he couldn't. He was 5. And I think that if you could see that much damage in a 5-year-old, it is very possible to think about year after year after year of that happening. And so
We see it all the time.
we see it all the time. And so we were very fortunate because there are a number of good private schools in this area. Not every area has that.
That's for sure.
That's true.
We were also fortunate because we could take the risk of placing our child there and being able to pay for the tuition, which is incredibly expensive.
Right.
And then we were able to work with Andy, and we have a settlement with the district. However, to back up to your question, what does this mean? So if I take Jack at 5, he could follow 2 very different paths. And without the work that I have done, that Andy has done, and without the advocacy that we have done on his behalf, he could have followed the easy path in Darien. He would have been given minimal services. He would have been treated as a very different child. The general education teachers would have taken no responsibility for him whatsoever. And because of the bureaucracy, the amount of time it takes to get anything done, you only have 8 months, 9 months as a school year. And so if you see a problem in September and it's not addressed till January, and then you don't really get any feedback until March, guess what? They're pushing your child on to the next grade. So when you hear these stories, like what you said about having a 7th grader who was not reading, you ask yourself how that can happen, particularly in what's considered a good school district. It is entirely possible for that to happen.
Yes, it is.
So Jack could have never talked. He could have, obviously, was already starting to develop some really serious self issues.
Self-esteem, yeah.
And then when that happens, going to school is akin to a hostile work environment.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to feel some confidence in yourself to be able to learn. And so he could have shut down completely, and he could have absolutely become a statistic of depression, higher rate of suicide, going to jail, substance abuse. There is no question that that is a path that Jack could have very, very easily taken. But instead, we have him on another path. And he went in 1 year from 35% intelligible to 70% intelligible. He was
In his speech.
In his speech. He was his first grade class representative for student council. He is learning to read. He is proud of who he is. And he is a very smart kid. And I would say that everybody who meets Jack thinks he's going to go on to do amazing things. But he's only going to go on to do amazing things because we have found a way to support his needs so that his great strengths can fly. I think that if you look at any child with a disability, whatever the level of disability, from the most severe to the least severe, a child has strengths and a child has weaknesses. And you have to support those weaknesses so that the strengths can truly shine. And Jack will have that ability, but we're talking about two completely different lives.
And that is going back to the point we started the segment with, the true benefit for the cost of special education. You have a student who hopefully will be a productive, amazing young man one day and will be a contributor to our society, as opposed to living on government assistance or being in some kind of an institution of some sort because he has no skills. And that's exactly what we
And it
think
bears
is important to
noting
highlight.
that the whole purpose of the IDEA is to prepare students for adulthood.
That's right.
And it really is that trajectory of bringing them from a young student to being able to be a productive member of society. We're going to be wrapping this up soon, but anything circling back to takeaway steps for parents on what they can do if they see this happening in their community?
Do you mean for the individual or as more of a systemic level?
I think more of a systemic level. Well, both, I suppose. But I think you're a great example of that. You brought this community together and knocked down some barriers of any shame that parents might have in talking about their kids with who have disabilities. So, I mean, you can certainly touch upon both, but I'm kind of interested in the fact that the group movement.
Yes. Well, I think that for both, actually, one of the very first, very important things to do is write everything down. Write everything down.
If it ain't in writing, it didn't happen.
Put everything in writing, and we do have the luxury of email now, which is wonderful because you can
timestamps
see
it and
what
everything.
you have written and when, and keep it. Keep what you have written, because what we find is that oftentimes we think that there's a small issue and we think it will be resolved quickly. But over time, we realize that the issue became much larger, or it was broader, or it happened to more people. And so it's very valuable to be able to go back and talk in fact. I think that it's important to stay in the realm of fact and not in speculation. It's a safer place to have a discussion. We can talk about what has happened, what is the law, as opposed to what somebody's motives are. It's not beneficial to try to figure out somebody's motives, who's working, whether it's somebody in your government agency, an administrator, a teacher. But what is very helpful is to know the facts. And then once you know those, talk about them. Talk about them with your friends. Talk about them with your neighbors. And very importantly, in your school, find a way to make a parent association for kids who have disabilities. And the school district makes that very hard, very hard to do. They will hide behind privacy, but push for it. Don't say no. Go to your PTO, go to the paper. And I also think sometimes, and I just, for my life in general, I definitely prefer to act first and ask questions later. And so I think that if you're going to work with a bureaucracy, then the best thing to do is just put a notice in that PTO website, and maybe afterwards they tell you shouldn't have had it in, but people saw it. And so just try to push
Can I say one more thing as a lawyer? The solution to this is not fundamentally legal. The legal remedies are fairly limited and ineffective. The ultimate answer is political. And school boards are elected and need to be reelected, and those people on the school board should feel the heat.
Yeah, and if necessary, be shamed, as you said earlier, Molly. I mean, ultimately, when it comes down to it, I say to parents all the time, and I'm sure you do too, and I'm sure you do too, Julie, when a parent calls me and I start to understand what's happening, and often in a small state, I know the district, and I know whether or not it's a district that generally complies with the law or not, and I have to sometimes say, getting your school district to have a fundamental change of heart is not something available to me at law. It's just not available to me. It's not something I can get a hearing officer or judge to order.
Right.
There are lots of other things that we can try for, but those fundamental changes, there are other remedies for. And being active and going in front of the school board, and if necessary, shaming them and saying this is unacceptable
And go
and
to
shining
your
a
school
bright
board
light.
meetings.
Absolutely.
Actually go to the Board of Ed meetings, go
Yes.
to the finance
Right.
meetings,
Right.
ask for meetings with each of those individuals,
Right.
form your own relationship.
One of the critical pieces here was we had an enterprising young reporter who thought this was a great story to follow, and he's been just a terrific benefit.
Yes.
A guy named Dave DeRoche
Yeah.
in this
Darien
case.
Times.
Yes.
And press is now increasingly local with local and
Yeah.
local and online often.
The patch.
And so the finding somebody who's actually interested on the outside and gets it can be very helpful.
Huge.
It's
Right,
enormously
right.
helpful in
He's
this case.
it's clear. I've been following it, and what's important, and one of the things that we wanted to bring to everyone's attention is we are confident that this is an example that is not an anomaly. Unfortunately, what's unusual is the level of evidence that you were able to get in writing, because typically you don't get to find that kind of a smoking gun. We know it happens, but it's usually not in writing, and usually have a hard time proving it. So it's important that we shine a light on this. It is an expose what you've done, and it's essential. If you want to share with us what's next in this story, do you think?
Well, Darien has hired this really a renowned national special ed expert to do an investigation. They've also hired a retired official from the State Department of Education to retrain the staff. There are three goals we have. One is that Darien clearly repudiate the policies of the past. That's happened not as strongly as we'd like, but it's happened.
Yeah.
Two is that we establish a scheme by which kids who lost services as a result of these illegal policies can get compensatory education to make up for it. We're in the process of establishing a scheme that's short of a due process filing on each one, and that could produce some results. And the third area, which is by far the hardest, is some accountability.
Yeah.
And I think the superintendent of Darien Schools said it right in the Wall Street Journal that those who are responsible need to be held accountable.
Yes.
And I would add a fourth, and that is from a national standpoint, continuing this conversation, making people aware of this issue, as we do believe that it's something that permeates districts throughout the country, unfortunately. And I know here on your specialeducationrights.com, Jennifer and I are going to continue to follow this conversation. And again, Molly and Andy, thank you so much for coming in and having this conversation with us. You guys have been terrific. And we thank you very much. And please feel free to share any of the comments that you have on our website. We're more than happy. We're absolutely going to be following this up and continuing this conversation.
Absolutely.